The sun hung mercilessly in the cloudless Arizona sky as Faith O'Malley slumped against the crumbling stone wall of the dried-up well, her throat burning with thirst and desperation. 3 days of wandering after her wagon train had been attacked by bandits had left her with nothing but the tattered dress on her back, and a growing certainty that the desert would claim her life before nightfall. Faith closed her eyes against the blinding sunlight, her cracked lips moving in silent prayer. The distant sound of hoofbeats barely registered in her exhaustion-addled mind until they grew impossible to ignore. When she finally forced her eyes open, a tall figure on horseback had materialized before her like a mirage, silhouetted against the punishing sun. "Madam," the deep voice called, as he dismounted in one fluid motion. "You'll drink from my canteen first." Faith stared up at him through the haze of dehydration, taking in his dust-covered clothes, the well-worn Stetson, and the kind eyes that contradicted the weathered lines of his face. As he knelt beside her and gently pressed the canteen to her lips, Faith knew that, whatever happened next, she would never forget the moment Mason Galloway had ridden into her life. The cool water sliding down her throat felt like salvation itself. Faith closed her eyes again, this time in relief, as she took small sips just as the stranger instructed. "Easy now," he cautioned, his voice gravelly yet gentle. "Too much too fast will make you sick." When she had drunk enough, Faith found her voice, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. "Thank you. I thought I was going to die out here." "What's a lady like you doing alone at a dried-up well in the middle of nowhere?" Mason asked, his brow furrowing with concern. He looked to be in his early 30s, with sun-bronzed skin and a short beard that couldn't quite hide a scar running along his jawline. Faith explained how her wagon train from St. Louis had been attacked 2 days back, how she'd been separated from the others in the chaos, and how she'd been wandering ever since, hoping to find water or help. "Bandits," Mason said grimly. "The Sanders gang, most likely. They've been raiding every wagon train and stagecoach between here and Tucson." He glanced at the setting sun. "Night's coming. My ranch is about an hour's ride from here. I can offer you shelter until we figure out what to do next." Faith hesitated only briefly. The alternative was certain death in the desert night. "I accept your kindness, Mr. Galloway, Mason Galloway." He helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. "And you are?" "Faith O'Malley." She attempted a smile despite her exhaustion. "School teacher, or I was meant to be, in Silver Creek." Mason's eyebrows rose. "Silver Creek? That's just a half-day's ride from my ranch. They've been expecting a new school teacher for months now." As Mason helped her onto his horse, positioning her in front of him in the saddle, Faith felt the first stirring of hope. Perhaps all wasn't lost after all. The journey to Mason's ranch passed in a blur for Faith, who drifted between consciousness and sleep, aware only of the steady heartbeat against her back and the strong arms keeping her from falling. When they finally arrived at a modest but well-built homestead, as the first stars appeared in the sky, Faith was barely able to stand. "My sister Clara will help you get settled," Mason said as he carried her into the house. "She lives here with me and my brother Ethan." Clara Galloway, a woman a few years younger than Faith, with the same kind eyes as her brother, took charge immediately, helping Faith into a bath and providing her with clean clothes. "Those bandits are getting bolder," Clara said, as she helped Faith into a simple cotton dress. 3 attacks in the past month. The marshal's been trying to gather a posse, but most men are too scared to go after the Sanders gang. Faith sank gratefully into the chair at the kitchen table, where a bowl of stew waited for her. "Your brother wasn't afraid to help me." Clara smiled fondly. "Mason's different, always has been. Ever since our parents died in '73, he's been the one holding this ranch and us together." Faith learned that Mason had inherited the struggling cattle ranch 10 years ago, when he was just 23. With hard work and determination, he'd managed to make it profitable enough to support himself, his younger sister, and their brother Ethan, who suffered from a leg injury sustained in the war. When Mason returned from tending to his horse, Faith noticed how he quietly assessed her improved condition, a look of relief crossing his features. "You're looking better already, Miss O'Malley," he said, taking a seat across from her. "Please, call me Faith, and thank you again for saving my life today." Mason waved away her thanks. Anyone would have done the same. But they didn't. Faith replied softly. You did. Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them before Mason cleared his throat and looked away. Tomorrow, I'll ride into Silver Creek and let them know you're safe, he said. You're welcome to stay here until you're strong enough to travel. Faith nodded gratefully, though the thought of reaching her destination suddenly seemed less urgent than it had before. That night, lying in Clara's spare bed, Faith found herself wondering about the quiet, honorable cowboy who had saved her life with nothing more than a canteen and kindness. Morning brought the sounds and smells of a working ranch roosters crowing, cattle lowing in the distance, and the aroma of coffee and bacon drifting under her door. Faith dressed quickly in the clothes Clara had lent her and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Mason already seated at the table, nursing a cup of coffee. Good morning, she said, suddenly shy. Mason stood when she entered, a gesture of respect that seemed automatic for him. Miss Faith, how did you sleep? Better than I have in weeks, she admitted. Your sister's been very kind. Clara's gone to check on a calf born yesterday, Mason explained, and Ethan usually sleeps late. His leg pains him most mornings. Faith busied herself pouring coffee, trying not to notice how Mason's presence seemed to fill the modest kitchen. You mentioned riding to Silver Creek today? Mason nodded. I'll let them know you're safe. The town's been without a proper teacher since old Mrs. Patterson died last winter. Faith set her cup down carefully. I'm not sure I'm ready to face them just yet. Everything I owned was in that wagon, my clothes, books, teaching materials. I have nothing to offer those children now. Mason studied her for a long moment. Sometimes what we think we need isn't what matters most. Those children need someone who cares enough to teach them, not fancy books from back east. His words struck a chord within her. Perhaps you're right, but I'd still like a few days to recover, if that's all right. Of course. I'll just let them know you're alive and will be arriving shortly. Mason hesitated. Unless you'd prefer to go back east? The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken implications. Faith shook her head slowly. No, I came west for a reason. I intend to see it through. Relief flickered briefly in Mason's eyes. Good, that's good. After breakfast, Faith insisted on helping Clara with the household chores, partly out of gratitude and partly to keep her mind occupied. As she hung laundry in the yard, she watched Mason in the corral, breaking a young horse. His movements were confident and gentle, never harsh even when the horse resisted. He's good with the difficult ones, Clara said, coming to stand beside Faith. Always has been. Animals, people. Mason has a way of earning trust. Faith nodded, unable to tear her gaze away from the scene. He saved my life yesterday. Clara gave her a knowing look. My brother's been saving things his whole life, this ranch. Ethan and me after our parents died. Even those wild horses others would have shot. It's who he is. That afternoon, Mason rode to Silver Creek while Faith continued to regain her strength. She met Ethan, the middle Galloway sibling, whose quiet demeanor masked a sharp mind and dry wit. Despite his injured leg, he managed the ranch's accounts and helped with tasks that didn't require riding. Mason says you were meant to be the new school teacher, Ethan remarked over lunch. Faith nodded. I was supposed to start next week, but now I have no teaching materials, no proper clothes, nothing. Ethan smiled. Silver Creek isn't exactly Boston. Those folks won't care much about fancy dresses or new books. They just want someone who can teach their children to read and cipher. By the time Mason returned at dusk, Faith had begun to feel like part of the household, helping Clara prepare dinner and listening to Ethan's stories about the early days of the territory. The town was mighty relieved to hear you're alive, Mason said as they sat down to eat. Marshal Thompson says they found 3 other survivors from your wagon train. They're recovering at the doctor's house in town. Faith gasped. Who survived? Do you know their names? A family named Wilson husband, wife, and their boy. They were pretty beat up but expected to pull through. Relief flooded through Faith. She had befriended the Wilsons during the journey west. Thank God. I feared everyone had perished. The marshal's organizing a proper burial for those who didn't make it, Mason added gently. And the town council voted to advance you a month's salary so you can purchase what you need to start teaching. Tears pricked at Faith's eyes. "That's extraordinarily generous." Mason shrugged. "That's how we do things out here. People help each other." Over the next few days, Faith settled into the rhythm of ranch life. She helped Clara with cooking and mending, read to Ethan from books in the small family library, and occasionally watched Mason work with the horses. She found herself drawn to the quiet strength that seemed to define him, how he spoke little, but his words carried weight, how his hands could be both gentle with a new foal and firm when repairing fence posts. On her fourth day at the ranch, Mason found her sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside her. Faith smiled. "I was just thinking how different this is from St. Louis. Everything here feels bigger somehow, more honest." Mason nodded. "That's why I could never leave, even when things were at their worst. This land gets into your blood." "Tell me about the worst times," Faith said, suddenly wanting to know everything about this man who had saved her life. Mason was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. Then, "After our parents died, we nearly lost everything. Bad drought, cattle prices dropped, and we had debts. Ethan had just come back from the war with his injury. Clara was only 16. He looked out at the land that had challenged him so severely. There were days I wasn't sure we'd make it to the next. But you did," Faith said softly. "We did." Mason turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the setting sun. "Sometimes, surviving is just a matter of taking one more step forward when everything in you wants to quit." Faith thought of her own journey west, leaving behind a comfortable but empty life as a companion to her wealthy aunt, choosing instead the uncertainty of teaching in a frontier town. "I understand that better now than I did a week ago." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of shared resilience, perhaps, or simply the comfort of finding someone who understood the cost of choosing a difficult path. The next morning, Mason announced he needed to ride into town for supplies and offered to take Faith with him. "You should see Silver Creek before deciding if you still want to teach there," he said, "and we can get you some proper clothes and whatever else you need." Faith accepted eagerly, longing to see the place that was meant to be her new home. Clara helped her dress in a borrowed riding skirt, and soon she was mounted on a gentle mare named Daisy, riding beside Mason towards Silver Creek. "The town's grown considerably in the past few years," Mason explained as they rode. "The railroad spur came through last year, and that's brought more settlers. They've got a proper school building now, instead of just using the church." As they crested a hill, Silver Creek came into view, a bustling settlement nestled in a valley, with a main street lined with wooden buildings, a white church spire rising above the rooftops, and the glint of railway tracks visible on the far side of town. "It's larger than I expected," Faith admitted. "About 400 souls now," Mason replied. "Plenty of children needing education." The townspeople greeted Mason with friendly familiarity as they rode down the main street. When he introduced Faith as the new school teacher, she was met with warm welcomes and expressions of relief that she had survived the attack. Mayor Peterson, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers, insisted on showing her the schoolhouse immediately. The simple building was larger than Faith had anticipated, with rows of desks, a pot-bellied stove, and shelves containing a modest collection of books. "It's not much compared to Eastern schools," the mayor apologized, "but we're proud of it." "It's wonderful," Faith said sincerely. "I can't wait to begin." After arranging to start teaching the following Monday, Faith accompanied Mason to the general store, where the proprietor's wife helped her select fabric for new dresses and basic teaching supplies. The town council's advance on her salary covered these necessities, and by midday, Faith's spirits had lifted considerably. "One last stop," Mason said as they loaded their purchases onto their horses. "I promised the Wilsons I'd bring you by if you were up to it." At the doctor's house, Faith had a tearful reunion with the Wilson family. Mrs. Wilson embraced her tightly, while Mr. Wilson, his arm in a sling, expressed profound relief at seeing her alive. "We feared the worst when we couldn't find you after the attack," Mrs. Wilson said. "How did you survive out there alone?" Faith glanced at Mason, who stood quietly by the door. "I wasn't alone for long. Mr. Galloway found me." "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Mrs. Wilson said, with a knowing smile that made Faith blush. On the ride back to the ranch, Faith felt a curious mixture of excitement about her new position and reluctance to leave the safety of the Galloway homestead. "You'll do well there," Mason said, as if reading her thoughts. "Those children will be fortunate to have you as their teacher." "I'm nervous," Faith admitted. "What if I fail them?" Mason's gaze was steady and reassuring. "You won't. And if you need anything, my ranch isn't far." That simple promise meant more to Faith than she could express. As they rode side by side under the vast blue sky, she realized that in less than a week, this wild territory had begun to feel more like home than Louis ever had. The weekend passed too quickly. Faith helped Clara prepare for the upcoming cattle drive, mended clothes, and even attempted to bake bread with limited success. On Saturday evening, Ethan taught her to play checkers, while Mason watched from his chair by the fire, occasionally offering Faith strategic advice that resulted in her first victory. "You're a natural," Ethan grumbled good-naturedly as she captured his last piece. "She had help," Clara pointed out, glancing meaningfully at Mason. "Good help is hard to find," Faith replied with a smile, meeting Mason's eyes across the room. Sunday brought a surprise. Mason had arranged for Reverend Scott from Silver Creek to ride out to the ranch so Faith could attend a service before beginning her teaching duties. "I thought you might appreciate some spiritual fortification," Mason explained when the Reverend arrived. The simple service, held in the Galloway's living room, drew in neighboring ranchers and their families. Faith sat between Clara and Mason, aware of his solid presence beside her, as they sang hymns and listened to the Reverend's sermon about finding strength in adversity. That evening, as Faith packed the few belongings she had acquired for her move to town the next day, Clara knocked on her door. "I brought you something," she said, holding out a small package. "It's not much, but I thought you might like it for your first day." Inside was a delicate lace collar that could be pinned to one of Faith's new dresses. "It was our mother's," Clara explained. "She was a teacher too, before she married our father." Faith's eyes filled with tears. "Clara, I couldn't possibly." "Please," Clara insisted. "Mason and I both want you to have it. Consider it a good luck charm." Later, when the house had grown quiet, Faith stepped onto the porch for one last look at the night sky. She found Mason already there, smoking a cigarette that he quickly extinguished when he saw her. "Can't sleep?" he asked. Faith shook her head. "Too many thoughts." They stood in comfortable silence, looking up at the stars that seemed close enough to touch. "Thank you," Faith finally said, "for everything. Not just saving my life, but for showing me kindness when I had nothing." Mason turned to face her. "You never had nothing, Faith. You had courage enough to leave everything familiar behind and travel west alone. That's worth more than any possessions." His words warmed her more than she could say. "Still, I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "There's nothing to repay," Mason said quietly. "But I hope—" He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "What do you hope?" Faith asked, her heart suddenly beating faster. Mason looked down at his hands, then back up at her. "I hope this won't be goodbye. Silver Creek's not far, and I come to town often enough." "I'd like that," Faith whispered. "Very much." For a moment she thought he might reach for her, but Mason simply nodded and wished her good night, leaving Faith to wonder what might have happened if he'd stayed a moment longer. Morning arrived with a flurry of activity. Mason loaded Faith's few possessions onto the wagon, while Clara packed food for her first days in town. Even Ethan had a parting gift, a small wooden box he had carved to hold her chalk and pencils. "The boarding house is clean and respectable," Mason assured her as they set off for Silver Creek. "Mrs. Finch runs a tight ship, but she's fair, and she's on the school board, so she'll look out for you." Faith nodded, trying to focus on practical matters rather than the growing ache in her chest at leaving the ranch. "I'll be fine. I've always been quite independent." Mason gave her a sidelong glance. "Being independent doesn't mean you have to be alone, you know." The words lingered between them as they traveled the now familiar road to Silver Creek. Faith found herself memorizing every detail of Mason's profile as he drove the wagon, wondering when she would see him again. Mrs. Finch's boarding house proved to be exactly as Mason had described, immaculately clean, modestly furnished, and ruled with gentle but firm authority by its proprietor. After helping Faith settle her belongings in her room, Mason seemed reluctant to leave. "If you need anything," he began. "I'll send word," Faith promised. "And thank you again, Mason, for everything." He nodded. his expression unreadable. "Good luck tomorrow. Those children are lucky to have you." With that, he was gone, leaving Faith to prepare for her first day as Silver Creek's school teacher. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity as Faith threw herself into her new role. The children, 26 in all, ranging from 6 to 16 years of age, proved eager to learn, if somewhat unruly at first. Faith quickly established routines and expectations, winning over even the most reluctant students with her genuine interest in their lives and her creative teaching methods. She saw Mason occasionally when he came to town for supplies or to meet with the cattle buyers. Their encounters were brief, but charged with unspoken feelings, a shared smile across the street, a few moments of conversation outside the general store, his tip of the hat as he rode past the schoolhouse. Each time, Faith found herself watching him leave with a sense of something important left unsaid. One Friday afternoon in late October, as Faith was dismissing her students for the day, she looked up to find Mason leaning against the schoolhouse door. "Mr. Galloway!" she exclaimed, unable to hide her pleasure at seeing him. "What brings you to town?" "Cattle business," he said, stepping inside and removing his hat. "And I wanted to see how you were getting along." Faith gestured to the empty classroom. "As you can see, the building is still standing, and all the children left with their limbs intact, which I count as success." Mason smiled, the rare expression transforming his face. "I hear nothing but good things about Miss O'Malley's teaching. Even the Peterson boy, who never took to learning before, is reading now." Faith blushed at the praise. "Tommy just needed someone to believe he could do it." Mason moved closer, his eyes taking in the colorful maps she had drawn on large sheets of paper, the student work displayed on the walls. "You've made this place your own." "I'm trying," Faith admitted. "Some days are harder than others, but I love it here." She hesitated, then added softly, "I miss the ranch, though, and all of you." Something flickered in Mason's eyes. "We miss you too. Clara says the place isn't the same without you." "And what about you, Mason?" Faith asked, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "Do you miss me too?" The question hung between them, more daring than anything Faith had ever said to a man before. Mason took another step toward her, close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Every day," he said simply. "Every single day." Faith's breath caught in her throat. "Mason?" Before she could continue, the schoolhouse door burst open and Mayor Peterson rushed in, his face flushed with excitement. "Miss O'Malley! Oh, Mason, good. You're here too. The most extraordinary news." He broke off, seeming to notice the tension in the room. "Am I interrupting?" "Not at all," Faith said quickly, stepping back from Mason. "What news, Mayor?" The mayor beamed. "The railroad company has agreed to build a proper station here. Silver Creek is going to be a regular stop on the line to Santa Fe." As the mayor elaborated on what this meant for the town's growth, Faith couldn't help but feel disappointed at the interrupted moment. By the time the mayor left, Mason had retreated behind his usual reserved demeanor. "I should be going," he said, replacing his hat. "Clara's expecting me back for supper." "Of course," Faith replied, trying to hide her disappointment. "Please give her and Ethan my best." Mason paused at the door. "There's a harvest social at the church next Saturday. Will you be attending?" Faith's heart skipped. "Yes, I'll be there. Mrs. Finch is insisting all her boarders contribute pies." "Save me a dance?" Mason asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice that Faith had never heard before. "Every dance," she promised. The week leading up to the harvest, social crawled by with agonizing slowness. Faith threw herself into preparing her contribution, an apple pie made from Mrs. Finch's closely guarded recipe, and spent far too long deciding which of her new dresses to wear. When Saturday evening finally arrived, Faith stood before the small mirror in her room, pinning Clara's lace collar to her best dress, a deep blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her hair, wondering if Mason would think her pretty. The church hall was transformed for the occasion, with autumn leaves, corn stalks, and dozens of candles casting a warm glow over the proceedings. A small group of musicians played lively tunes as couples twirled around the makeshift dance floor. Faith had barely stepped through the door when she was surrounded by her students and their parents, all eager to chat with the teacher who had become a beloved figure in the community. She smiled and conversed, all the while searching the room for a glimpse of Mason. "He's not here yet," a voice said beside her. Faith turned to find Clara Galloway, lovely in a green dress, smiling knowingly. Mason had to deal with a broken fence before he could leave, but he'll be along shortly. Relief flooded through Faith. "Clara, I didn't know you were coming to town for the social." "And miss seeing my brother try to dance?" Clara laughed. "Not for anything in the world." As the evening progressed, Faith danced with the mayor, several fathers of her students, and even young Tommy Peterson, who stepped on her toes but beamed with pride at having the courage to ask his teacher to dance. Still, there was no sign of Mason. "He'll be here," Clara reassured her during a break in the music. "Mason Galloway is a man of his word." Faith nodded, trying not to show her growing concern. It wasn't like Mason to be late, especially when he had specifically asked her to save him a dance. As the musicians began what they announced would be the final song of the evening, Faith resigned herself to disappointment. She was considering leaving early when a commotion at the door drew everyone's attention. Mason stood in the doorway, still in his work clothes, his face grimy with dust and a dark stain that looked suspiciously like blood on his shirt. "Mason!" Clara hurried to her brother. "What happened?" "Sanders' gang," Mason said grimly. "They hit the Miller place. John's hurt bad. Doc Thompson needs to come now." The news sent a wave of fear through the gathering. The doctor immediately gathered his things, and several men volunteered to form a posse. "I'm sorry," Mason said when he spotted Faith across the room. "I know I promised—" "Go," Faith said, understanding immediately. "People need help." As the men organized themselves, Faith impulsively approached Mason. "Be careful," she said quietly. "Please." Mason's expression softened for just a moment. "I will." Then he was gone, riding out with the other men into the darkness. The social broke up quickly after that, with families hurrying home and locking their doors. Faith returned to the boarding house, where Mrs. Finch gathered her female boarders in the parlor for safety. "The Sanders gang hasn't hit the town directly yet," Mrs. Finch explained as she distributed cups of tea. "But they're growing bolder, 3 ranch raids in the past month." Faith barely slept that night, her mind filled with worry for Mason and the others who had ridden out to confront the bandits. When she finally drifted off near dawn, her dreams were troubled. School was closed on Monday as a precaution, with many families keeping their children home until news came that the immediate danger had passed. By Tuesday, word reached town that the posse had tracked the Sanders gang to their hideout, but had been forced to retreat after a brief gunfight. John Miller would survive his injuries, but his ranch had been burned to the ground. Faith was just closing up the schoolhouse on Wednesday afternoon when a rider approached at a gallop. Her heart leapt, thinking it might be Mason, but it was Ethan Galloway, looking grim despite his usual composure. "Ethan, what's wrong?" Faith asked as he dismounted with difficulty, his injured leg clearly paining him. "It's Mason," Ethan said without preamble. "He went back out after the Sanders gang alone. Clara and I just found out he left a note. He thinks they're planning to hit Silver Creek next." Fear clutched at Faith's heart. "When did he leave?" "Last night. We need to warn the town, get everyone prepared." Within the hour, Marshal Thompson had organized the townsmen into watches, positioning armed guards at key locations around Silver Creek. Faith insisted on helping, volunteering to keep lookout from the church bell tower, which offered a view of all approaches to the town. As dusk fell, Faith huddled in the tower with a blanket around her shoulders and a spyglass borrowed from the general store. Every distant movement made her heart race, wondering if it was the gang approaching or Mason, returning safely. The hours crawled by. Faith's eyes strained in the growing darkness, and her thoughts turned increasingly anxious. Why had Mason gone alone? It was brave but foolhardy, so unlike his usual careful nature. A movement on the western approach caught her attention, a single rider, coming fast. Faith raised the spyglass, her hands shaking. The figure was too distant to identify, but something about the way he sat in the saddle. "Rider coming!" she called down to the men below. "From the west." As the rider drew closer, Faith's certainty grew. It was Mason, and he was pushing his horse hard. She flew down the bell tower steps, heedless of decorum, reaching the street just as Mason thundered into town. "They're coming!" he shouted, reining in his lathered horse. "Sanders and at least 15 men, less than an hour behind me." The warning sent the town into frenzied preparation. Women and children were hurried into the stone-built bank for safety, while men took up defensive positions. Faith refused to take shelter, instead helping Dr. Thompson prepare the church for potential casualties. Mason found her there, laying out bandages. He looked exhausted, his face drawn with fatigue and a fresh cut visible on his cheek. "You need to get to safety," he insisted. Faith straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm staying right here. These people are my responsibility too." Mason started to argue, then seemed to recognize the determination in her eyes. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Says the man who went after 15 outlaws by himself," Faith retorted. A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. "Fair point." Before either could say more, shouting erupted outside. The Sanders gang had been spotted approaching the town. "Stay inside," Mason ordered, drawing his revolver. "Promise me." Faith nodded, though she had no intention of hiding if people needed help. The next hour passed in a blur of gunfire, shouting, and terrible waiting. Faith prayed harder than she ever had in her life, not just for Mason's safety, but for everyone in Silver Creek who had become her community. When the shooting finally stopped, Faith rushed outside to find several townsmen wounded, but none killed. 3 of the outlaws lay dead in the street, while the rest had fled, including Sanders himself. "Mason!" Faith called, frantically searching the crowd. "Has anyone seen Mason Galloway?" "Over here!" someone shouted. "He's been hit!" Faith's world narrowed to a single point as she ran toward the voice. Mason was propped against the wall of the general store, his left shoulder bloodied, but his eyes alert. "It's not bad," he assured her as she knelt beside him. "Bullet went clean through." Relief made Faith's voice sharp. "You could have been killed. What were you thinking going after them alone?" Mason winced, though whether from pain or her scolding wasn't clear. "I was thinking of you," he admitted quietly. "Of everyone in this town, but mostly of you. I couldn't bear the thought of them bringing their violence here, to where you are." Faith's anger melted away, replaced by a surge of feeling so powerful it left her breathless. Without caring who might see, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a brief, fierce kiss. "Don't you ever scare me like that again, Mason Galloway," she whispered against his mouth. When she pulled back, Mason was looking at her with wonder, as if seeing something precious and unexpected. "Does this mean I finally get that dance?" he asked, a smile breaking through his exhaustion. Faith laughed through tears she hadn't realized were falling. "As soon as you can stand without bleeding all over my dress, yes." Dr. Thompson insisted on Mason staying in town overnight for observation, setting him up in a room at the hotel. Faith visited the next morning, bringing breakfast and finding him already restless with inactivity. "The marshal says they caught 2 more of the gang trying to cross the border," she told him as she poured coffee. "Sanders got away, but with half his men either dead or captured, he may think twice about coming back." Mason nodded, absently touching his bandaged shoulder. "Town's safe for now, at least." Faith set down the coffee pot and took a seat beside his bed. "Clara and Ethan are coming to take you home this afternoon. The doctor says you need rest." "Will you come visit?" Mason asked, reaching for her hand. "The ranch has felt empty without you." Faith entwined her fingers with his. "I have school until Friday, but I could come for the weekend if that's all right." "More than all right," Mason said, his voice husky. That Saturday, Faith rode out to the Galloway ranch, her heart light with anticipation. Clara welcomed her with a knowing smile, while Ethan teased Mason about looking presentable for the schoolmarm. After dinner, Mason suggested a walk to see the new foals in the corral. The evening was cool but pleasant, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "How's your shoulder?" Faith asked as they walked side by side. "Healing well," Mason replied. "I'll have full use of it soon enough." They stopped at the corral fence, watching the horses graze peacefully in the twilight. Faith felt a contentment she had never known before, standing beside this quiet, honorable man in the land that had tested them both. "I've been thinking," Mason said after a comfortable silence, "about what happens next." Faith turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" Mason took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "When I found you by that empty well, half dead from thirst, something happened to me, something I can't explain. It was like like I'd found a piece of myself I didn't know was missing. Faith's heart began to race. "Mason, let me finish, please," he said gently. "These past months, watching you build a life in Silver Creek, seeing how you've become part of this community, it's only made me more certain. I love you, Faith O'Malley. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you took that first drink from my canteen." Tears blurred Faith's vision as emotions overwhelmed her. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've loved you since you carried me into this house and treated me with such kindness when I had nothing to offer in return." Mason cupped her face in his hands. "You had everything to offer. You still do." He hesitated briefly before continuing. "I'm asking you to marry me, Faith, to make a life here, with me. You can keep teaching. I'd never ask you to give that up, but I want to come home to you every night. I want to build something lasting, together." Faith didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure. 1,000 times, yes. When Mason kissed her, Faith knew she had found her true home, not in Silver Creek or St. Louis or any physical place, but in the arms of the man who had offered her water when she was dying of thirst, and in doing so had given her so much more than simple survival. They were married in the Silver Creek church that December, with Clara as Faith's attendant and Ethan standing proudly beside his brother. The entire town turned out for the celebration, including Faith's students, who presented the couple with a handmade quilt stitched with messages of good wishes. Faith continued teaching, riding to town each morning and returning to the ranch each afternoon. In time, they converted an unused bunkhouse into a small schoolroom for children from neighboring ranches, allowing Faith to teach closer to home when winter weather made the daily journey difficult. 2 years later, Faith gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Hope, who inherited her father's quiet strength and her mother's love of books. A son followed 2 years after, completing their family. On the 10th anniversary of the day Mason had found Faith by the empty well, they returned to the spot, now transformed. Mason had built a new stone well there, one that never ran dry, with a small cabin beside it to shelter travelers in need. "From desperation to hope," Faith said, reading the words Mason had carved into the well's wooden cover. "That's what you gave me that day." Mason took her hand, his love for her as steady and true as it had been from the beginning. "We gave it to each other," he corrected gently, "and we've been drinking from the same canteen ever since.